Well, thank you so much. I am delighted to be here and also super grateful for both my mom and dad are on and my sister, who really, I dedicated the book to my mom and dad because they really, were such a huge part of me becoming the person I am today. And I'm very grateful for them. And I just want to set the stage that my intention with this book and with today's message is, and this discussion, really, it's more of a discussion than a message, is to expand love. And that's what the definition I landed on for an entrepreneur is, that a spiritual entrepreneur is that they have an enterprise, which may not be a for-profit business. It could be a nonprofit or a project or a regular business. And that they do that from the intention of expanding love and not extracting gain. And so that is what I feel like is, I would like for the intention for today and for this group. And I'm really grateful to be here. And I think Katerina and I are going to do some dialogue before I dive in.
Absolutely. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us. I've read your book and found so much inspiration and thought and love behind it. So it was a beautiful way to start off the message today. Can you tell us in a few words what inspired you to write the book and a little bit of your backstory? So how did it all emerge?
Yeah, it's really interesting with the backstory part. So for those of you, when you do get the book, or if you want to be, I think we only have 10 people on here, so everyone could get a copy of the book. It was really thinking about how do you tell a story? I do have it in a few pages in a chapter, because I felt like it was in chapter 1. I felt like it was important for people to understand my spiritual context, because I believe spiritual entrepreneurship is inclusive of all faiths, or even people who don't profess to have any specific religion, because the expansion of love is really not, anybody can do that. And so, but I wanted people to know where I was coming from the Christian background, and sort of what experiences God's put in my life that have brought me to this journey. And the interesting thing about anybody's journey is they're all really unique. And I feel like that's by design. I feel like everyone has their own, path to God, to the divine, their own path that they carry love forward. And I feel like a lot of people don't tell a story from the middle of the journey. Like so many of books, especially business books, are like, oh, I made $1 gazillion and you should listen to me because now I'm rich and I have the secret formula. And so my book is sort of an antidote to the secret formula. It's more like, hey, I'm going to tell you about my journey where I am right now. And that journey isn't perfect. And that journey has struggles and pain and suffering and mistakes and changes of perspectives and multiple perspectives. And I feel like it's really important, especially for people who are doing the work, to understand what it's like being in the middle of the journey, rather than having reached some climax where you're now famous and rich, because I don't think that's not the goal. The goal of spiritual entrepreneurship is growing love and having an eternal perspective. And so that was where the book came from. And choosing the backstory and the things I put in the story, we're trying to put in there this idea, like in the song, Look at Your Life Through Heaven's Eyes, which, by the way, is the way I end the book, is direct quote from that song, is this idea that God does intend for good for all of us. And that every single thing that happens in our life, whether we feel like it feels good or not, God uses for the good, uses to expand love, uses to grow us closer to each other and to Him. And I really believe that. And I think there's a way that you can look at your life from a bigger perspective. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. It's a way to do that. But I think you can look at your life from a bigger perspective and say, okay, what's God trying to do with this pain or this joy or this struggle? And for me, a big part of it was being in a very legalistic cult-like church when I was 17 to about 23, where it was very strong you're in or you're out. It was very exclusive, and it wasn't even, it wasn't even if you believe in Jesus, you had to believe in Jesus the exact same way, get baptized this way in this church, or you're going to hell. And it was very, very damaging. And I ended up marrying an abusive man as a result of that. That was really a painful situation for me and kind of launched me onto this whole thing. So if you had asked me when I was 24 to tell my life story, I tell it a lot differently because I didn't have the perspective to see my life through heaven's eyes and how important that was for my spiritual development to go through that, and the gift that that church gave me, truly. And I'm grateful for that.
And that is a beautiful way of putting it. And I know in this church community, we talk a lot about inner growth and how that impacts our outer growth, outer impact. Can you share in a few words how this transitioning in your inner life impacted the work that you do today through Indigo?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the interesting thing about the book, the other thing that was cool about the backstory is I had realized, okay, so my whole life with this was this like amazing preparation, and still is. And then Indigo was sort of a case study, which actually Rich was the one that told me to do that, because Rich read my very first manuscript, which was a total mess 3 years ago. And he's like, well, why don't you have more Indigo in there? Like, Indigo is like your baby. Indigo is my company, Indigo Education Company. And he's like, and I was like, well, I don't want to feel like I'm self-promoting or I'm trying to be salesy. And he's like, no, Indigo's your baby. And so then I went back and looked at the story of Indigo and how Indigo, and my experiences in working in the public education system, was just as painful and damaging as what I was looking at in venture capital. So for example, I say the principles of venture capital are exclusivity, ranking and sorting, and money. And when you really get into the education system, it's about exclusivity. Can you get into the best college, the best school, the best money, the best zip codes? Ranking and sorting, I mean, that's what we do with kids with the SATs, with all these standardized tests. I mean, literally, they're ranked. Like, you're the valedictorian or you're number 235. I mean, we literally rank children. And then money, you think, oh, education's not about money, but the whole thing, the whole system is set up around accountability, around money. And so it helped me realize, oh, the work we're doing at Indigo is the same work as spiritual entrepreneurship, which is about inclusivity. Everyone has value. Everyone was born for a purpose. Everyone was made in the image of God. And if you can separate from your ego self into your true self, then you can find your use and your purpose, which is what the Swedenborg quote was talking about that we just read. And so we are about inclusivity and education, and about spiritual value, and about enoughness. So instead of some people get more, some people get less, there's enough for everyone, which is an abundance kind of idea. But I think that word abundance, and I talk about this in my book, has been sort of hijacked to mean money again. Like, oh, well, if you're abundant, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of things, you're successful, you're famous. So I feel like abundance in God's view is about enoughness. It's about having enough and not having this insatiable hunger that we feel like we have to feed, of like greed or fame or validation or all these things that feed the ego. The enoughness is like you're satisfied and you have enough and you can give to everyone else. So there is enough for everybody. And that's sort of Indigo to me is about bringing these principles of spiritual entrepreneurship into our public education system and into people finding fulfilling work and purpose based on their true self.
And you didn't think of it as a spiritual enterprise from the get-go. In your book, as I've read, you sort of had this transition from thinking about it as a business, as an entrepreneurship, to social entrepreneurship, to spiritual entrepreneurship. Can you talk to us a little bit about that thought process journey?
Yeah. So I started, thinking of more of a social enterprise. Like, there's something called social entrepreneurship, which is about doing good and still having profit. They also call it like triple bottom line. Talk about this in my book. And I was thinking about it more like that. But the thing that I realized is that whole world has, again, good intentions, a lot of good founders, some people doing amazing work, but the money system around that, the investment system, again, is really focused on profit and doesn't really include room for the soul or something deeper or something transcending beyond this life. And so I was stumbling around, I raised about $1 million with Indigo to just get it off the ground. I've been doing this 10 years now. And I did accelerators and all the stuff, hired consultants, blah, blah, blah. And just nothing was working for me. And it was very confusing and quite frankly, quite debilitating for me and painful because I blame myself. I was like, something's got to be wrong with me. Like I must be a bad leader or a bad business person or just a bad person. And then, it was the middle of the pandemic and beginning of the pandemic and we almost shut down. And that's where I found the writings of Swedenborg. And then the writings of Swedenborg really uplifted me into this new perspective of use, which totally aligned to everything we were doing with Indigo and with correspondences and love and inclusivity and all the things I had been thinking about was like in Swedenborg. And then someone told me there was a Swedenborg church, which I had never heard of. And then introduced me to Rich. And Rich was the one really that first used the word spiritual entrepreneurship. And it was like this moment of clarity. It was like, I'm a spiritual entrepreneur. I didn't even know this existed. And it was so fantastic. And that's one of the things I hope with the book too, is that people who are spiritual entrepreneurs, but have never heard the term or don't know what it is, that they have that moment where they feel like, oh my gosh, there is a place for me. I'm not bad. I'm not wrong. The system is just not set up to serve and to work with spiritual entrepreneurs. And so I wanted to put my experiences of how spiritual entrepreneurship was really different in a lot of ways, like mentorship, profits, pricing, exit, all that's in the book of how being a spiritual entrepreneur actually is quite different. I call it the rules of the road. The rules of the road are different. And there's a totally new perspective to look at it. Not that you have to look at my perspective, but offering my perspective and my journey with Indigo, looking back in order to promote a new field and a new way of doing business.
And can you share with us some tools of the trade? Like what are some of the resources that you found particularly helpful to you?
So the tools of the trade that I go through in the book are prayer. Of course, I think prayer is critically, vastly important, maybe the most critical part of being a spiritual entrepreneur. And then I also talk about meditation and different ways of meditating. So we think of a lot of, Americans think of prayer as you're asking, right? It's this dialogue, but then meditation is more of a receiving prayer. And there's also, there's like Lecito Divina, there's centering prayer, there's different ways. I've recently really been getting into Jewish meditation, which has been really eye-opening for me. And so I feel like prayer tool, figuring out a prayer practice for yourself, really critical. And then I also talk about surrender and discernment. So there's a lot of tools. And the other thing I talk about is that the tools that work for me might not be the tools that work for you, because I actually feel like the tools that work for us are tied to our gifting and our purpose and our path. And so I'm just offering a few tools. And so that's one of them.
So I love how you bring the book full circle and end it back with thinking about self-development for spiritual entrepreneur. Can you very quickly walk us through what are some of the stages for self-development and maybe one key tool or practice our community here, our little group, can take away with us?
So the self-development chapter is my second to last chapter, chapter 7, because again, this is so parallel to Indigo. Indigo is all about self-development and finding your true self and becoming this version of yourself is closely connected to the divine spark made in God's image. So there's a process to it, just like everything. It's not a one and done. It's a linear evolving process, like spiraling up is the way I look at it. And that also aligns with the Swedenborgian teachings. And the process I chose is from a man named Dr. Robert S. Hartman, who I have 2 chapters dedicated to his work, which is all about the science of value. And he talks about intrinsic value, intrinsic systems. And spiritual entrepreneurship, again, because it's about the individual, it's about intrinsic systems and value in the sense that you have value just by being you. You don't have to do anything. You just, because you exist, because you were created, you have intrinsic value. And he talks about the way to come to that process of self-development is through self-awareness, knowing yourself. That's the first step. And Indigo really is about that first step. We have assessments where you can help to become self-aware. And Rich has talked, there's a lot of sermons that Rich has talked about self-awareness. So I encourage you to go find them on our website. But then the next thing is choosing yourself, which is a really interesting idea. Another way to think about that is accepting yourself. So it's like, okay, I've thought about who I really am, and not just my personality, but like how I was born, who I was born to, what time in history, what color of my skin, how I look. We have almost no control over most of who we really are, of what we are. But so you have to accept that and choose that. And there's something about that acceptance that's very powerful and very liberating. And it's like, okay, God set this up for my good, for a purpose. And then you create yourself or grow yourself. So I call it co-creating with God, to like go deeper into that process and grow and think about some of the things that separate us from God or separate us from love. And really, that's like a whole process. And then you give yourself. And I talk about Jesus as the greatest example of giving himself on the cross and through his life and through his example. And then you do that all over again. You just keep doing that until you die. And the tool that I would like to offer from that process, that I didn't actually write this in my book, but I've really been thinking about it a lot, is to just take some part of your life that maybe you struggle with guilt or shame or blaming yourself, or you haven't forgiven yourself or others, and rewrite it from the perspective of heaven's eyes. And a way to think about that is if the perspective brings up feelings of separation or guilt or shame, that's probably not, because God doesn't shame us or blame us. Or so if it's from that perspective, it's probably you haven't hit the heaven's eyes perspective. And the other perspective, I think, especially white Americans particularly like to have, is this overcomer's perspective. I made it, I achieved, I'm the winner, I'm great. That perspective is a deceiving one, because our society actually applauds that perspective. It's this overcomer's perspective. But the perspective from heaven's eyes is usually a much more complex, multi-dimensional, forgiving, beautiful perspective that brings like gratitude and love to your heart and to your life and to the people around you. So that would be my offering for a self-development tool.
Wow, that was so powerful. Thank you, Sherry. I put in a comment into the chat, and at this time I want to invite others to either unmute themselves and ask their questions directly, or put it into the chat and we'll read them out for Sherry. But I just wanted to add one more note is we, in our work together with Ms. Cheryl Robertson here and Soulful Life University, we actually used Indigo Pathway and Sherry's assessment. And in the comments that our young leaders, we work with a lot of young 18 to 24-year-old out of school youth who are looking for opportunities and looking for full-time employment. And we just saw so many aha moments and kind of click-throughs. And I will never forget how one young lady came into the program feeling stuck. She couldn't like get out of her head. And after doing the assessment, after doing that self-reflection and work that you're talking about, Sherry, she really, at the end of 4 weeks, she said, I'm no longer feeling that way. And she was actively pursuing opportunities, which was so inspiring. So I really see this in action and really see what you're doing work. So thank you so much for offering that wisdom and blessing to us.
Thank you. I'm eager to hear the questions.
As people are thinking about questions, I'll just throw a quick observation. It's just what's so striking about the book, which I loved, and also the way you articulated today. We are, if you believe we're on the cusp of an evolutionary change in the world, a spiritual new level of consciousness, that means our economics are going to change, our politics are going to change, the way we treat each other, and if you believe it's going to be a better world, then we have to imagine, what does that look like? And what I loved about your book is you're describing what business could look like in a sort of post-capitalist focused system, which I think served its purpose very well, actually, in transitioning from an earlier system, but has kind of run its course. And you're offering a new way to look at economics and business. And what I loved about the book is you also, you juxtaposed traditional entrepreneurship with spiritual entrepreneurship, so people could see in little rows what the differences are, and then social entrepreneurship and spiritual. So you made it very clear for people what this is how it looks differently in the world. The only other thing I'll share about the book that I thought was super interesting was what everybody asks. Okay, that's nice, Sherry, but I still need money. Like I'm still underpaid. I still have rent. I still have car payments. I still have debt. I've got a credit card and I've run it up. And get me out of that, Jesus. And give me your spiritual entrepreneur magical wand for that. And you talk in the book about manna, and that's really unique to you. You've really come up with that metaphor. And I just wonder if you could just quickly share the manna, how manna in the Bible works, and how money might be represented in our life.
Yeah, so the whole book has a huge Moses theme, and that the Prince of Egypt song we play at the beginning is about Moses. And in the Moses story, for those of you who don't know it, it's we just passed Passover, and that's where he was a Hebrew slave that was saved by a princess in Egypt, and then was banished, and then came back to basically set the Israelite people free. But he was the one that gave the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And that's considered, like, to the Jewish people, that is the word, that is the most sacred part of the Bible. And that is the giving of the law. And it was essentially a marriage contract. It was like, hey, we're getting married. Like, you Israelite people and God, we are getting married, and we are going to be this example of walking together throughout the earth. And then these people had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And that's the other interesting thing about spiritual entrepreneurship. We always want these like linear straight paths to like success. What's the fastest way to success, right? That is not how God works. He basically like married the people, and then they wandered around where they were completely dependent on him in this wilderness for a year. And he sent the food down in manna, which was this like special cool food, and the people could eat it, and that would sustain them. And so I think about spiritual entrepreneurship and getting money more of the manna system. And the thing was about the manna is if you collected more than your share, more than you can eat in a day, it would go moldy, it would go bad. So you couldn't collect more than you needed, because it kept the people dependent on God. And so a lot of times spiritual entrepreneurs are kind of in that system where you just get just enough to pay your bills, just enough to pay your payroll, just enough to do the next project. It doesn't mean that there aren't some spiritual entrepreneurs who suddenly come into a ton of money. I'm not saying that's not possible, but I would say the vast experience is more the manna, where God gives you just what you need to do your work, so you stay dependent on him, and the money isn't what keeps you going. That's not your food. The manna from God, the relationship, the connection, that's what keeps you going. And that requires a lot of trust. And that's really been our experience for 10 years. It's been pretty interesting. So I call it the manna system.
That's awesome. Any questions from anybody? Comments? thoughts, concerns, arguments?
Quiet group.
Hello, Sherry.
Hey, Cheryl, you're looking fabulous.
Thank you very much. And hello, my community of friends. Nice to be with you all. Listen in, Sherry. Every time I hear you even talk a little bit about the spiritual entrepreneurship, something just leaps inside of me. I feel so inspired. And I guess my question to you is, how do we take this beautiful message to the world? You probably don't have an answer to that question outside of buying your book, but it speaks so much to me because it's first time I met you, I felt like I knew you all my life. I felt such a kindred spirit with you because you speak my language. And I want to be an incubator of that. I want to share this with my family and with my friends so just how do we continue to take this message and just share it over and over and over again?
Well, thank you for that sentiment, Cheryl. I think part of the reason why we feel so connected is I see you as a spiritual entrepreneur. What you and Katerina are doing with Soulful Life University is a spiritual enterprise. I mean, that's exactly what you're doing. And I think you share it by being it. You are it. You're such a light. And every time I feel the same way, every time I talk to you, my heart jumps a little and I'm like, oh, Cheryl. Oh, and it's not that you haven't had suffering. Like when you spoke about your journey, it was incredibly moving. And you have that incredible perspective of seeing your life through heaven's eyes and then going through those processes of self-development and then giving back. And so I think something that would help is for those of us who do identify as spiritual entrepreneurs to use the language, to not be afraid of it. Like I am kind of afraid of it, to tell you the truth. Like I've been putting off putting out the book because I'm afraid. And I have gotten pushback, like interestingly, the most among the evangelical community, who the idea of inclusivity and the idea of the true self being made in God's image and being divine, getting that confused with ego, and then them feeling like the true self is wicked, that we're born into sin, like all those things, that spiritual entrepreneurship flies in the face of that because it really honors the divine spark in all humans, and that we were born from God and to be connected and be with God and be one, to be all together. I use a lot of Jewish imagery in the book because I feel like the Jews kind of kept that idea of ahad. Every day they say the Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. And then Jesus added, love your neighbor as yourself. That is in the middle verse of the Torah, which is extremely significant in Judaism and the way they read their Bible, is love the Lord your God. And that is the message. So love is the message.
Yes.
But what's interesting is, I don't know how, but somehow there's some Christian sects that we've gotten away from love is the message and bringing it back to love and showing people a new way of following Jesus that really is rooted and grounded in love. And in business, which you do, I think is God bless you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective.
And we put a link to Sherry's book into the chat for those who are interested. You can also, as you think of those questions, feel free to put in your address, your name and address, and you can privately chat to me and I'll collect them and send them over to Sherry.
Yeah, and I'll also put the outline. I have the outline online. If you want to like look through the different sections, because the interesting thing about the book is you don't have to read. It's pretty long. It's a lot longer than I intended it to be. So you don't have to like read it linearly. You could be like, oh, I want to read about empathy. I want to read about mentorship. And so you can kind of jump around to the different sections when you get it. And I have the table of contents that's on that website I sent you is in the beginning of the book.
So you mentioned how some in the evangelical community reacted to the book. Can you share how perhaps some entrepreneurs in a traditional sense of the word reacted? And if you had pushback, how did you respond?
So I feel like God has really encouraged me because also there's been plenty in the Christian community who've been really supportive of the book as well. So I don't want to put any sort of, judgment on that. So I apologize if that came across that way. I feel like God has really encouraged me because I've been trying to take the book to like do the last few edits, like I found little things I want to change on plane flights. And every single time the person next to me on the plane flight took the book and they were really different. Like one was actually a pastor from Denver who was looking to get out of ministry. The churches are closing. And he's like, I never thought of business as a ministry. And he's like, I want to find my business as a ministry. And so like he took the book. And then another guy, he was actually, he was a flight attendant. He was a flight attendant on the flight. And I had a row to myself and he came and sat next to me and he's looking at the book and he's really trying to work on being an actor and doing acting that breaks barriers with race. He was an African-American man and he's like, oh, do you think I could be a spiritual entrepreneur when I'm trying to like bring more love and equality into the acting world? I'm like, yes, of course you am. He's like, I want the book, And so I've had a lot of really interesting people from different walks of life who, I actually don't think many actual entrepreneurs have read it, but people who want to be entrepreneurs or people who never identified as a traditional entrepreneur, finding like, oh, this could be a path for me. And I would love for more and more people to go on this path. And as Rich said, we need new economic systems. We need new systems for everything. But I do believe we're coming into a time where there can be a new economic system where more people can get into spiritual entrepreneurship. Because right now, the path right now is like venture capital, where you have to be this big behemoth thing. And it's really hard to get capital if you're just trying to like change your town or serve like a specific community in a small way, which I think is equally valuable. You can't judge. That's why I put the scripture I talked about with Peter and John, where he's like judging, even the disciples were saying, oh, well, John's better because he's not going to die. And they just misinterpreted Jesus's words. And Peter's like, oh, I'm comparing myself to John. I'm going to die. Laura says that Peter was actually crucified upside down in his old age. And John was the only disciple that died of natural causes, but he still died. So this idea of like comparing, like that whole comparing game, I think can be taken out if we have another economic system that doesn't do that sort of comparison. And then if entrepreneurs don't compare themselves to other people and that has been a big struggle for me. I'm like, why does that person get all this money and all these contracts and all these schools? And I'm still on the manna system. And really working through that and taking that out of my field has been so liberating.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.